The Falcons held their own versus the Dolphins in day two of joint practices, with the youngsters on defense stepping up and making plays.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So welcome back to this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And of course, you know me as your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black. And guys, today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. Just visit underdogfantasy.com or find them in the App Store and sign up with the promo code Locked On, and you'll get your first deposit doubled up to $100. And guys, before we get started on today's episode, we thank each and every one of you that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. Shout out to the everydayers. Follow in their footsteps by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we'll be breaking down all of day two of Miami Falcons joint practices. We'll be talking a little bit about what it all means, these 2 days of practices, and sort of what are our big takeaways. We'll talk a little bit about sort of our expectations going into Friday's preseason matchup with the Dolphins and how much of the starters we'll get to see. And then later in the episode, we'll be looking at a listener question asking about sort of Bijan Robinson's usage in his route tree as part of this whole positionless or alignment agnostic, as I've recently heard it referred to, sort of brand of football that the Falcons are bringing here. But let's kick things off talking about day two of joint practices. And from the sounds of it, it seemed like another sort of back and forth day where both teams sort of had their moments, and both teams being able to get the better of each other in certain circumstances. And so when we talk about sort of who won the day, I don't think there's a clear-cut winner. Now, I'm sure we'll be able to find various people saying one side or the other is declared the victor. But, sort of as we mentioned on yesterday's episode, when we compare these 2 days of joint practices against the Dolphins to the multiple days going back 2 years ago against the Dolphins, going back last year against the Jets, where there seemed to be a clear-cut winner in those, right? The Falcons really dominated the Dolphins on that first day, at the very least, and then I think the Dolphins kind of came back on day two back in 2021, and the Jets, at least according to the Jets beat writers, were wiping the field up and down the floor with the Falcons on both days of those joint practices. But we didn't really get that this week, regardless of who you talk to. It didn't feel like anybody covering the Dolphins or the Falcons was ready to sort of declare someone a clear-cut winner. And we'll talk sort of about what is our kind of takeaway from that. Maybe that these two teams are maybe a little bit more evenly matched than we think, but we'll get into that a little bit later on the episode. Now, one thing that did seem to be the case, at least in the one-on-one sessions, was today was a little bit of a rebound day for the Dolphins offensive line after a rough day the previous day. And we talked about how maybe yesterday's strong play performance of the Falcons defensive line was having to do with the fact that Teron Armstead, the Dolphins left tackle, did not practice yesterday, but he did return today. And so it did feel like, they got a little bit of a boost from having, one of the best left tackles in football actually practicing on this day. So that may be a factor in why the Dolphins looked a little bit better. It did seem like things got a little feistier in the trenches and elsewhere on the football field. There was a couple of scuffles. David Onyemata got involved with the offensive line. Micah Abernathy and Robbie Chosen got into it. Nothing major or anything, no punches or anything like that. But, guys were jawing with one another, had to be sort of separated from one another, that sort of thing. It's almost as if like they pegged Ronald Acuna with the way that, our team gathered together and whatnot. But, if the defensive line didn't assert its will nearly as much today as it did the previous day, it did feel like the back seven sort of stepped up and picked up some of the slack, right? That, the practice went indoors in the second half. whether it was a weather issue or a heat issue. I know Miami's been dealing with storms all week long, so it could have been either one in that case. And also, it is as hot as the sun down there uh, as well. So it could have been either one, dealer's choice when it comes to that. But they went indoors. They were doing some end of game red zone sort of situations with the starters going up against the starters. And the Falcons defenders, especially in that back seven, came up big when they were going up against the Dolphins once, right? There were 3 straight plays where the Falcons were able to disrupt the pass. Troy Anderson broke up the first pass, then D. Alford nearly picked off the next pass and sort of knocked that pass out of bounds. And then on to his third pass, Jalen Hawkins came down with the interception to sort of end that sort of series. And when the Falcons offense was in a similar situation prior to that, Ritter did complete a pass to Mac Hollins on the first drive, on the first play, but then was quote unquote sacked by Jalen Phillips on the next play. And then I believe Bradley Chubb was able to beat Jake Matthews on one play, and that drew a penalty, kicking or tripping sort of penalty, and that sort of ended that drill for the Falcons offense. So they started strong, but then kind of faded on that series of plays in that sort of end of game red zone sort of situation. But similarly, I think they got into it with the backups, and it didn't sound like the Falcons backups did as well as the starters seemed to do, at least defensively. Dolphins quarterback Skylar Thompson and Mike White were led their respective units to scores and whatever drills they were doing, including Thompson having sort of a game winner on a big play to Devon Achane at the end to sort of wrap up practice and quote unquote win the scrimmage. Taylor Heineke threw a pick at one point as well. So it looked like the Falcons starters looked the part, but maybe the backups left a little bit left to be desired. But we'll get into sort of the big takeaways from day 2 of the practice, as well as the overall week of practices. But one indicator that I do think is in the Falcons' favor, at least yesterday, if not for the entire week, was the Dolphins on Wednesday's practice did not have anybody in an orange practice jersey. Apparently the thing that the Dolphins do, where they'll have a practice player of the day from like the previous day, and the next day, if they have a great day of practice, the next day they'll wear the orange jersey. And there's like other perks that they get, like they can select a playlist or something like that. But on Wednesday, there was no orange practice player, which means there was no practice player of the day from Tuesday. And that's basically Mike McDaniel, the Dolphins head coach, kind of telling you that he thought his team needed to step it up on day 2 because he wasn't willing to sort of declare that anybody, went out there and really balled out, although, Tyreek Hill might have deserved it. But, whether or not someone did wind up stepping up on Wednesday for the Dolphins, I'll let Kyle Krabs of Locked On Dolphins, break that down. But it sort of tells me everything I need to know about the Falcons kind of holding their own against this Dolphins team this week. And that leads into the conversation on what we can glean from glean about this Falcon team from these joint practices. And I think we can glean some things about the team, but we'll probably learn a little bit more about what this team is in their preseason matchup against the Dolphins on Friday. And we'll also talk about our expectations for that preseason game coming up on today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, it is August, and it means fantasy draft season is here. And probably the best way to play fantasy football is at Underdog and playing in best ball. And if you don't know what best ball is, if you're a seasoned fantasy owner, you've had that experience of, trying to set your lineup and you put the wrong guy on the bench and you start the wrong guy and it completely tanks your day, on Sunday. And, best ball basically takes that out of the equation. And Underdog is basically going to set your lineup for you. So you just kind of set it and forget it. And for those of you that aren't seasoned fantasy, and maybe you've been on the fence, you don't really play fantasy, but I think best ball is also kind of the best way to start playing fantasy football because you don't really have to do really any work. You just do whatever you need to do to prep for the draft. That could be buying, a $5 fantasy magazine or printing off a cheat sheet for free on the internet or whatever. And then you just kind of draft. And then, many months later, you can reap the rewards of that draft with, best ball mania. Underdogs, fantasy football contest is the largest contest of all time. There's $15 million in total prizes. Who wouldn't want that? And then the winner gets like $3 million. So that seems like, you know, a pretty good way to kind of jumpstart your fantasy football playing career. Like, oh, I'll just do this one thing, take a couple of hours to draft a team, and then maybe in 4 months I'll have $3 million in my pocket. So if you want to participate in Underdog Fantasy, regardless of your experience, just visit underdogfantasy.com or find them in the App Store. And then when you sign up, make sure you use the promo code Locked On, and you'll get your first deposit doubled up to $100. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code Locked On. So continuing today's Locked On Falcons, let's talk a little bit more about sort of our big takeaways from these 2 days of joint practices. And, you know, going back to something I said probably earlier this week before they made the trip down to Miami, talking about my expectations, you know, I tend to put a little bit more stock in these joint practices than I do regular practices, right? Like if you, you know, and the short answer to why is because, you know, they tend to be a little bit more competitive. You know, you don't have the same level of familiarity that you typically have with your regular practices. And, you know, I kind of think of it as a stepping stone, right? If a regular season game is up here, joint practices are down here, and then, or I'm sorry, regular practices are down here, and then you have joint practices as one step up. Then you have the preseason games, which is a step above that till you get to the regular season game. And I tend to try to put more stock in the joint practices and the preseason games than I do the regular practices. And that's why you'll hear me often dismiss like practice or like, you know, it's like the furthest thing from an actual game. So I wouldn't put as much stock into it as maybe some other people do. But it's, you know, let me reiterate the point to make it clear. It is not me saying that practice doesn't matter. It very much matters for players and coaches. I just don't think you and I, fans, should really care all that much about it. But sort of my big takeaways from this week of joint practices, I think the Falcons answered the call. You know, I think if we're just sort of taking this at face value without any of the sort of context of, you know, what does this mean in comparison to a real game or whatever, you know, I think you probably went into this, if we're just going to assume who's the better football team going into this, there's no reason to think that the Dolphins aren't the better team. They're coming off a 9-8 record. They probably would have won 10 or more games had Tua been healthy for the entire season, right? You know, that's a playoff team from last year. That's a team that has playoff aspirations this year. You know, they're right now on FanDuel. They're 11th in, you know, the best odds to win a Super Bowl this year. So that does make them one of the upper third teams in the NFL. And so you take that at face value going up against a Falcons team coming off a 7-10 season with allegedly a bottom 3 quarterback, at least based off of pretty much every quarterback ranking you have. You know, everybody thinks Desmond Ridder, at least everybody outside the state of Georgia thinks that he, you know, he's one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL. And you would think like, oh, the Dolphins should absolutely, you know, own this scrimmage because they're just on a different level, right? And that didn't happen, right? And the Falcons are a team that, you know, when you look at their Super Bowl odds, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, you know, they're 21st in the NFL in Super Bowl odds, tied with the Patriots, or the team that most people think are going to finish last in the AFC East, right? And so essentially you have the 11th best team in the NFL, at least according to FanDuel, going up against the 12th worst team in the NFL, which is the Atlanta Falcons, at least according to FanDuel. And the fact that it came out relatively even is very promising for the Atlanta Falcons. And again, you know, I don't want to draw a direct correlation between how the Falcons performed in these practices to how they would perform in an actual game against a real game, not a preseason game, a real game against the Miami Dolphins. Because if this was a regular season game, the Dolphins would probably be favored in that game. And there would be certain matchups, you know, that would be very different or whatever. But this Dolphins team is a team that has built themselves as a team, you know, that can challenge in the AFC. They expect to challenge some of the better teams in that murderer's row of a conference that is the American Football Conference. And the fact that the Falcons could essentially battle them to a draw is impressive for the Atlanta Falcons, right? And, you know, it's not to push this narrative of the Falcons are great because they were good against the Dolphins in the scrimmage, you know, because ultimately your greatness, if you want to say that, is proven not in practices during the summer, but in the games during the fall. And we'll see how the Falcons fare, you know, 1 month from today, as many of you guys are listening to this, on September 10th when they face the Carolina Panthers. But it is nice to see that the areas that the Falcons were working to improve this offseason, especially the defense, right, came to play this week, right? We talked about the defensive line coming to play, especially on yesterday. And we talked about how, some of those playmakers on the back seven stepped up and made plays. And it wasn't necessarily the Jesse Bateses of the world or the new faces that were making the plays. It was some of the young guys, D. Alford, year 2, Troy Anderson, year 2, Jalen Hawkins, going into his 4th year in the NFL. And so those are some of the things that you definitely wanted to see this week. How good is this defense? And I think you come out of this week feeling a lot better about, this defense may live up to the hype to a certain extent this upcoming season. And then you look at the offense, and, I think the offense comes out of this week remaining a work in progress, but I think you saw the flashes that you wanted to see, especially here on Wednesday, where like they weren't really at full strength and they were able to do some good work, and what I mean by that is that Kyle Pitts was held as sort of the team portion of practices. Right. He got some 7-on-7 work, I think, yesterday, but I don't know if he was in the 11-on-11 and stuff. And so, as I've said many times before in this podcast, when it comes especially to the offense, it's not where you start, it's where you finish. But I think you like where the starting point is based off of what you've seen against this Dolphins team today. Like they're not in, they're not in the best place, but they're also not in the worst place. Like they're in a good place as far as their starting point based off of what we've seen this week. So, when we're speaking of where you start and not where you finish, that's a decent segue into talking about who's going to start in the preseason games, right? Arthur Smith did say after practice on Wednesday that the Falcons starters will play this summer, right? And just to be determined on how much they play this week and next week, right? We pretty much assume they won't play in that 3rd preseason game. That will be devoted to all the sort of back end roster guys that are probably going to be the 37 ish guys that are going to get cut, the week after that on August 29th. But, based off of last summer, we can't base any precedents off of the previous summer because Arthur Smith refused to play anybody in that preseason. But based off of last summer, the starters did get one series of work in the first preseason game, and then they got a whole quarter in the second preseason game. Right. And, last summer, we didn't have a joint practice ahead of the first preseason game, but we did have a joint practice ahead of the second preseason game against the Jets, right? And, some of the starters' workload, as little or as much as it was, I think part of that was owed to the Falcons wanting to give Desmond Ridder a very long look last summer. So they may have played their starters even more if they didn't have, Desmond Ridder on the team working with the backups, right? And I'll be curious to see sort of how that dynamic works this summer with Desmond Ridder. Now you kind of want to get a long look at him as well. He needs the reps, but at the same time, like, he is a starter. And do you want Jake Matthews out there for 25 snaps? Like, I don't know. Right. But also, do you want Desmond Ridder out there without Jake Matthews if he's going to play 25? So that's going to be an interesting question. So we'll get into the speculative part of today's episode because, this is not me saying what the Falcons will do or what Arthur Smith said. This is just me guessing, right? And my guess is that you'll probably want to give the starters at least 5 or 6 series over the course of the preseason at a minimum, maybe more, right? And that roughly corresponds to like a half of football, right? Because a typical NFL game is going to have 10 to 12 series, 10 and 12 possessions. And so half of that would be about a half. And, how they split that up over the next 2 games, I have no idea. Like it could be 1 this week and then 4 next week. It could be 3 this week and then 3 next week. Again, no idea. But I would be surprised at this point if we don't see the starters for at least a series on Friday night against the Dolphins. Right? My best guess, again, we'll see them for 2 or 3, maybe a quarter's worth of work, and then they'll pull the hook on them at that point in time. As far as the defense, their precedent last summer was they played, I think, only a series in both games. I don't know if we're going to see that much more of those guys, or at least select starters. Like, maybe Troy Anderson, instead of getting 2 series worth of work, he gets 5 series worth of work. But Grady Jarrett only gets 2 series worth of work. So that may be something that they kind of figure out over the next couple of weeks. And certainly they'll have to figure out before Friday's action. But we'll sort of see how that goes. That will certainly be a topic of conversation on tomorrow's episode, where we'll be joined by Jarvis Davis of the ATL Day Ones podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. We'll pick his brain on sort of who he's looking at, players, units, etc. we'll also get my thoughts on that. Spoiler alert, for me, when it comes to the preseason, I'm going to be focused primarily on the rookies and the second year guys. So the Troy Andersons of the world, the Desmond Ritters of the world, along with the Zach Harrisons of the world, those are going to be the guys I'll be focusing on in this first preseason action. But I'll also be focusing on some of these Dolphins offensive linemen too, because, maybe one or two of these guys might be a future Falcon swing tackle. So we'll get into that potentially on tomorrow's episode, but we'll wrap up today's episode talking more about positionless football, and we'll answer a listener question on Bijan's usage, or I'm sorry, Mr. Bojangles' usage as a route runner. And we'll see, if we see some exotic formations and the like with Bijan this season, and we'll get into all of that to wrap up today's episode. So, guys, wrapping up today's episode, we have a listener question from AJ, and W are my initials. He left a comment on yesterday, I believe's YouTube video, or one of the videos this week, which is a great way to, get your questions in. And he says, I'm really excited about the prospect of positionless football around the league, but especially in regards to our Falcons. With that in mind, will Bijan have a full wide receiver route tree this year or ever? Will he and Algier line up in the backfield together much or at all? Will they pass out of the 23 formation? What other wrinkles could we see? How crazy could/will it get? By the way, I love the show and am definitely an everydayer. Thanks for your great work, Mr. Drew. Appreciate that, AJ. You and all the other everydayers are the reason why I get out of bed every single day. And occasionally, I'll shave for you guys to be presentable on this illustrious podcast. But to answer your questions, in terms of Bijan running a full route tree, maybe, if he does, I don't think it's going to be this year, right? We've discussed in the past a little bit that you can look at Arthur Smith's usage of Cordero Patterson in 2021 as sort of a baseline for an assumption of what at a minimum we'll see Bijan utilized as. And as we discussed after that 21 season, I wasn't necessarily giving Arthur Smith as much credit for quote unquote unlocking Cordero Patterson that year as others were. Because I think a lot of the ways that he utilized him that year weren't necessarily super creative ways of using it. A lot of it was just like, let's get the ball in his hands and let him go out there and make a play. So that manifested itself, in a lot of sort of hitches and screens, shallow stuff over the middle or into the flat that were designed to get him the ball on like check downs and whatnot, and let him go and be, that all-time great guy with the ball in his hands. Cause he's arguably the best kickoff returner of all time. And clearly you got some type of skill set when you get the ball in your hands, if you can do that. But when we did see Patterson line up as a wide receiver out wide at times and run some vertical routes, some fades, some go balls, or certainly some of the memorable plays he made in that regard. But, not to say that, that requires no skill from the play caller, but like, it's like, use your speed, run past that corner and we'll throw you the ball, or, run past that corner, we'll throw it up and you go get the ball. Right. That's kind of what fades and go balls are. Right. And since we've seen that before in this offense, like, I think it's a safe assumption to think that we might see Bijan do some of that stuff as well. But beyond that usage, I don't know. Right. Because, we're talking about Bijan running a full route tree, a full wide receiver route tree, but the wide receivers in this offense arguably don't run a full route tree. You hear me joke constantly about, there's only 4 routes in this offense if you're a wide receiver. And it's the dig, the fade, the slant, and the out. And like, I say that half jokingly because I'm being hyperbolic and exaggerating that, it's not just 4 routes, but like, those 4 routes make up a larger percentage of the routes that you'll see, say, a Drake London or Mac Hollins run than you'll see from other comparable number 1 or number 2 receivers in other offenses, right? They'll run a higher percentage of those routes. So it does make up a larger percentage, a larger bulk of their routes, and thus makes it seem like they only run 4 routes, right? Because it's not as diverse. And so the idea that they'll ask Bijan to run a full route tree if they're not asking the receivers to run a route tree, I'm skeptical of. But, I think if I'm making an educated guess, we'll probably see a lot of screens, hitches, wheel routes, the occasional angle route, but nothing super, super exotic. Just a lot of stuff. Get the ball in Bijan's hands quickly after the catch, let him make a play, run by this defender on the wheel route, and we'll throw it up to you. Those sorts of things. Now, when it comes to Bijan and Algier in the same backfield together, yeah, I think we'll see a decent amount of that. It could be, putting a number on it. Any number between like 10 times this year or 50 times this year. I don't know if it's going to be a staple of their offense, like a half dozen times each week, which would be about 10% of their offense each and every week. But I think they'll certainly have a package, and they'll use that selectively at various points in various situations this upcoming season. In terms of passing out of the 23 formation, Ritter's first touchdown passing to Michael Pruitt last year in Week 18 against the Bucs was out of 23 personnel. And for those that don't know, 23 personnel is 2 running backs and 3 tight ends. On that particular play, Keith Smith was the second running back, but he was actually lined up more as a tight end in that situation. And they had Kobe Gossett, the offensive lineman, as an eligible receiver as that third tight end in that situation. And given the plethora of running backs and tight ends that they have, especially now with Pruitt being back in the fold, like they can figure out, which 2 running backs, which 3 tight ends they want to have. But I doubt you'll see it outside of like short yardage, goal line situations. That particular play to Pruitt last year in that Week 18 game was a 3rd and goal from the 2-yard line. So those types of situations, but probably you're not going to see it on a 1st and 10, when they're at the 37-yard line or something like that. Now, as for other wrinkles, I expect the exotic looks that the Falcons will be more in the run game than they will be in the pass game. Like, I think we'll see some wishbone, and with 3 running backs in the backfield, we probably won't run the triple option out of that wishbone, but you'll see some interesting ways and some wing T type of stuff that you'll see with how he wants to utilize these positionless players, and having that guy line up as a wing back and a tight end and an H back and all these various things when they play, other positions and whatnot. So I think you'll see more exotic stuff in the run game. I think whether we see that exotic stuff in the pass game, I think remains to be seen with Arthur Smith. But, I wouldn't necessarily expect too much, given he's got a first-year starter at the quarterback position. Like, I don't expect Arthur Smith to get in his bag, at least not early in the season. Again, it's not where you start, it's where you finish. So I would love to be talking in December, right, when we're doing the all 22 reviews on Tuesday night here on YouTube, or Wednesday morning on your preferred audio podcast platform, right? I suspect early in the season it'll be a lot of like, let's evaluate Ritter when I'm doing those breakdowns on the podcast. But my hope is, my dream this upcoming season is like, early enough in the season, it'll be pretty established that Ritter's pretty good, right? Like, again, he doesn't have to be elite, but just like solid enough to like, he's playing good football to help you win football games. And so by the time we get to the end of the season, like, those breakdowns can be more devoted to like the different exotic packages that Arthur Smith is incorporating in the offense. And we can talk about, okay, like he ran this formation on 4 different plays, and here's how he ran this play. And it kind of the second play builds off of the first play, and the third, that sort of like, that's my dream to do on the podcast. We'll see if the Falcons allow me to live my dream here on this illustrious show. But, those are kind of my expectations when it comes to that. So I think we'll see a good, healthy amount of positionless stuff. I don't know if they're going to turn it up to 11 like I think some people are expecting, but I would love to see it. It would certainly make this team a lot funner to watch on Sunday. So you will not hear me complaining about all the different looks that they're doing. And if Arthur Smith is in his bag from the jump, I'm all for it. But I would just say, again, it's not where you start, it's where you finish. So wouldn't expect, week 1, he's going to come out and throw all these crazy things at Carolina. I'm sure he'll throw some crazy things at them, certainly, in that opening play script and whatever. But, at the same time, like, I think you got to build it, right? So that is my thoughts. I hope that answers your question, AJNW. And, we'll get into more topics on tomorrow's episode with Jarvis Davis of the ATL Day Ones podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. Continue to make us your first listen here on Locked On Falcons. And then we'll be back. And make sure you check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on Friday night, because Jarvis and I will be doing a postcast, but we'll plug that on tomorrow's episode. If you want to get sort of the counter narrative, go check out Kyle Krabs on Locked On Dolphins as your second listen today, to see sort of his take on things. And Kyle's a very smart person, one of the smartest football people I know. And so check out his stuff. He's definitely not going to blow smoke up your butt. So we'll see what he has to say about the Dolphin side of things. So it's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every stinking